All right. Well, it's good to see you. Here we are, week 6. We're moving on to concrete engagement each week with some of the most pressing contemporary moral problems in the world. So starting with, and this is chapter 21 from our textbook, the issue of global economic justice. So this is the last chapter in our textbook, but we're beginning with this as an issue primarily because of the main primary source reading that we'll be working through together under the guidance and direction of Group 1 for our first debates or group discussions, presentations, however you'd like to understand that particular assignment on Wednesday. And so today we're really, and this is going to be typical for Mondays at this point. Let me let people in here. Yeah, so what we do today will be fairly typical with respect to our class task for every Monday leading up to the presentations or the debates. So we'll really just be setting up the nature and scope of the problem, some of the historical and conceptual aspects that play into or that construct or constitute the issue, and then getting some clarity together on a good deal of the vocabulary, the conceptual vocabulary that will help us to make sense of the problem and gain some understanding on the adequacy of possible responses. And then also gain some clarity on what is obligatory exactly. And so today we'll be talking a lot about concepts like distributive justice, egalitarianism, libertarianism, and of course that language has a different meaning or different layers of sense to it depending upon the contextual application. So here we're not talking about libertarianism, for instance, as a political ideology, but rather a kind of conceptual orientation within the history of ethics, particularly the history of applied ethics. So we have our first groups on Wednesday. Group 1 is made up of Ayani, Ryland, and Jackson. And they will be defending primarily and presenting and defending primarily the theoretical approach and argument that undergirds it of Peter Singer, so a major contemporary utilitarian philosopher who teaches at Princeton. And then Group 2, made up of Connor, Diana, and Michael, will be defending John Arthur's critical response to Peter Singer. So this is an instance, and it won't always be like this as we go ahead in the subsequent weeks, but this is an instance in which the philosophers whose views and arguments we're addressing and spending some time with are actually in coordination. So they're explicitly reacting to one another. In this case, Arthur is criticizing Singer. So there is another, for instance, there's another reading at the end of this chapter in the primary sources. And this author was mentioned a couple times in the reading for today, Garrett Hardin, but I'm not asking you to read his work because he's been pretty much rejected by philosophers, naturally, but he's not even very much taken seriously anymore by ecologists or economists. So Elinor Ostrom, for example, was the first woman to win the Nobel Prize for economics, who died in 2012, published some devastating research against Garrett Hardin's really pernicious and simplistic and racist and overall horrifying argument. But of course, that is available, and if you and there is the research element to the assignment for these presentations, so you might examine the argument of Garrett Hardin. And then there's also in that section of chapter 21 an essay by a couple researchers, not Ostrom, but some other researchers who are criticizing Garrett Hardin. But Hardin's approach can be understood as implicitly, at least, attacking Peter Singer, although Peter Singer's famous article affluence, morality, affluence, and losing the name of the article now. Poverty, those 3 words, they're in there: affluence, morality, poverty. That was published in the 1970s. Garrett Hardin's so-called Tragedy of the Commons lifeboat ethics work came out more than a decade previous to that, right? So they're not really taking up each other directly. Okay, so are there any questions about this project that we're beginning on Wednesday? So from groups 1 and 2, are there any issues that you'd like to address or questions about anything? You're having trouble contacting any members of the groups or anything like that? No? All right, cool. Well, I look forward to that. So the assignments for those 2 groups with respect to the position at issue that the members have to articulate and defend, that was decided randomly by a coin flip. And so I reached out, and I'll do this in the future as well, I reached out directly to those groups to tell them which positions they had to take up. And so on Wednesday, we'll begin with group 1, who will defend this kind of Singerian idea or argument for what is obligatory, what is that for which we have a duty in terms of global economic justice. And then group 2 will represent kind of John Arthur's response to that, as well as whatever else in terms of pursuing the research aspect of the assignment you guys uncovered and want to discuss. And so each group will have, 15, 20 minutes. I'm not going to have a timer or anything. It's not too important that you keep a strict observance of the time. But then after that, we'll just have a general class discussion where we'll all be able to achieve some mutual understanding on some of these difficult questions and problems. And yeah, so that's about it. But if any questions come up, just let me know. And so Wednesday or Thursday, I'll be reaching out to next week's presenters, so groups 3 and 4, to give you the terms of how that debate will go. So which group has to represent or defend which particular approach or perspective. Okay, so any questions about that? All right, so I trust most, if not hopefully all of you were able to complete the midterm exam over the weekend. Did anyone experience any technical difficulties with it or anything like that? I imagine I would have gotten an email about it, but no. How did you guys feel about the exam? Was it difficult, easy?
I thought it was really reasonable.
Okay, I like that. So not exactly easy, but not overwhelmingly.
I think it just depends how much you pay attention. I mean, I personally thought that it was pretty, I mean, not necessarily easy, but not too taxing. But if you don't pay attention, I don't think it would have been too easy.
Okay, good. And of course, you're sitting there, the comforts of your own home. Well, I guess I'm assuming that your home is comfortable. But in any case, yeah, you had all of the resources available to you, the textbook, your notes, and so forth. So I'm hoping it wasn't too much of a source of anxiety. So, all right. So I will be, obviously, since most of the exam was made up of multiple choice and true-false questions, quite a bit of it was graded automatically for me, but I still have to grade the fill in the blank kind of short answer questions, and it won't take me too long. So by the end of this week, most certainly, I'll have all those grades in. Probably by Friday, I imagine I'll get around to that. All right. So before we get into this material, so another thing, just to prepare us for typical Mondays at this point, as we go ahead dealing with these or addressing and talking about these real world, concrete contemporary problems. Most of the time we'll get out of here early on Mondays, because we're not going to get into the real substantial arguments until Wednesday. And so I'm just going to sort of prepare us and help us in the fruitfulness of our dialogues, looking ahead to Wednesdays by dispelling any obscurity and clarifying any concepts and how these concepts relate to each other, what they imply, what they presuppose, and so forth. And like today as well, I have a short video offered through, I think it was created by the people behind Curiosity Stream. That's somewhat recent. Well, it's pretty recent. It's from 2019. And it gives a nice brief overview or big picture of the state of global inequality. So we'll watch that. I want to take some time to examine together one or two of the ethical dilemmas from chapter 21 in our textbook. And then I have just 10 or so slides to help us prepare for the real substance of this particular debate once we meet again on Wednesday. Okay. But before we watch this video, I wanted to show, this is just kind of funny. I mean, there's a virtual infinity of these memes now related to the trolley problem, but this was new to me. I think it's the group Philosophy Matters or something on social media that either created or shared this, and I was able to see it. It's pretty funny. And it connects to this week's ethical issue to some extent. So let me just share the screen.
Definitely probably leads to different answers.
Yeah. I mean, how do you suppose your own internal calculation of this particular problem might impose itself upon you, depending upon where the you is in the scenario? I mean, it's funny, but it's also not that funny. And can anyone see how this relates to this week's topic of discussion? How is it relevant for the matter of global economic justice, for example?
Probably considering that obviously people have different economic standings, and so people that are better off may not be as concerned with the problem as those that are theoretically going to be smushed by the trolley.
Right. Or to use Garrett Hardin's lifeboat metaphor, if you're one of the affluent members of the wealthy country that's represented quite reductively, quite unhelpfully and simplistically by this lifeboat, you might think, well, like Garrett Hardin argues, how he concludes, well, I think this is just how it is. This is just how the world is, and it kind of sucks for this guy who is aggressively trying to get in my boat, but you know what? I'm sorry. I wish he wasn't in the water, but I can't really give up any more space on here. But then I imagine your moral calculation might run quite a bit differently if you're the guy or the woman or the child foundering in the water, right? And so we've talked about the concept, particularly in chapters 3 and 4, when dealing with moral reasoning and preparing the ground for moral theory. We talked about the concept of what is it called? God, my head, it's so cloudy today. The John Rawls thing, equilibrium. God damn it, reflective equilibrium. Okay, I'm not getting much sleep. I have these incredibly loud fans and this like humidifier machine in my kitchen right now because of the kitchen floor I think I told you about that's completely destroyed by water damage. And so this machine turns on periodically through the night and just wakes me up, and I haven't been sleeping. But And I don't know how much longer these machines are going to be in my house either. They won't tell us. They just come every day and check on them. But so reflective equilibrium. So does anyone remember when we talked about that? We would have, if it weren't for the holiday that prevented us from having a class discussion on chapter 4, we would have talked about it in greater detail. But this was a problem, or rather an approach to a particular problem that comes up when adjudicating the hierarchical relationship of some of those criteria that we use to test the viability or efficacy or desirability of various moral theories. So sometimes implications or directions given by a given theoretical orientation can be in tension, I might say, with our basic intuitions. And so when that happens, and we can think about these intuitions more robustly in the language of considered moral judgments, right? When a moral theory tends to conflict or to be in tension of some kind with a moral judgment, that's not just a knee-jerk reaction, but it's a particular conclusion that we've been brought to arrive at through substantial thinking, as a shared kind of thinking. But when conflicts arise of that nature, John Rawls, so this important 20th century moral philosopher, whose major work is called A Theory of Justice, and he really tries to synthesize consequentialist and non-consequentialist intuitions or moral conclusions on these issues. But in his theory of justice, he uses one of the more obscure formulations of Kant's categorical imperative. So depending on who you ask, this is formulation number 4 or 5. There might be 7 or 8 ultimately of these versions of the categorical imperative. But this one is usually labeled the kingdom of ends formulation. And it is the one that political scientists or those who are working in the domain of ethics who adopt, for whatever reason, a bigger picture kind of political or political economic stance turn to. Because the other formulations, so the ones that we've spent time with, 1 and 2, one being grounded in logic and the other being grounded in universal respect, those make more sense or are more intelligible when discussing interpersonal relationships and contexts that sustain such interpersonal relationships and encounters. But the kingdom of ends formulation says very big picture. When we're considering what kind of society or what kind of civilization, and we can be talking, as we'll see in later discussions when this comes up, we can talk about the desired society from the point of view of a cosmopolitan orientation. And a cosmopolitan view is one that says we are citizens first and foremost of the world, right? So cosmos meaning the all or the universe, and then politan referring to the member of a given polis, which is a Greek word for like city-state, for example. And so that's obviously where we get words like politics, political, and so forth. And so really big picture, thinking about the kind of global organization, social, political, economic organization that we want, in pursuit of this reflective equilibrium that would help us perhaps not dissolve, but better manage tensions or contradictions that arise between our considered moral judgments and what a given moral theory seems to prescribe, we should put ourselves in this position. And Rawls refers to this as the original position. And he draws on this kingdom of ends idea of Kant. And so I'll say something first before getting into the original position about Kant's so-called kingdom of ends. And it should already make some degree of sense for us what that means if we understand the second formulation, the means-end principle or formulation of the categorical imperative, which says that we should never treat others as a mere means to our own ends or even another's ends, but rather as strict ends in themselves. And so that has to do more immediately, in our sense, with interpersonal relations and the contexts that make them possible. But from a bigger picture political point of view, Kant asks us to imagine as an ideal, not how things actually are or ever have been, but as an ideal towards which we are working as cosmopolitans, so as members of the global community. We ought to imagine a world in which everyone is respected as an end in themselves and not a mere means for anyone else. And then because of that observation or recognition, the social, political, and economic institutions, legal, economic, political institutions that we construct and that we sustain through various efforts across time ought to reflect that recognition that everyone is an end in themselves, and ought to foster the continuance of that recognition. And so that's the kingdom of ends idea from Kant. So hence the political side or political bent. We're looking for a kingdom, but again, from the point of view of cosmopolitans, that is, avowed citizens of the world. And so John Rawls does something with this in terms of the original position. He says, all right, imagine, and this is a purely kind of abstract, ideal state of affairs that you are putting yourself into, theoretically. So he says, imagine we, as citizens of the world, can take a step back and say, well, let's redesign all of the various political, economic, and legal structures that define our way of being and make possible certain relationships. Let's start from scratch. Let's start from the ground up. What kind of world would we want to devise? And what sort of questions or what sort of considerations would we, as would-be legislators who are involved in this project or process, what are these things that we ought to keep in mind that are of decisive importance? And he says, go into this original position now, where we're the original position. There are no legal frameworks. There are no existing cultural, moral, political institutions, organizations, and so forth. We're doing the work of putting us all out there in the world from the beginning. So he says, imagine in this original position, this is again Rawls, largely building on Kant, but Rawls says, you're in this original position under what he describes as a veil of ignorance. So imagine everyone in this original position has a veil of ignorance, which means because you're beneath this veil, you have no idea about various accidental or incidental characteristics or features that would concretely, in given situations, set you apart from others and put you at a disadvantage or perhaps a greater advantage. So factors such as your race, your ethnicity, your gender, your sexual orientation, your socioeconomic background and status, whether or not you're able-bodied, whether or not you have any sort of physical or cognitive impairment, right? So all these factors that you are more or less thrown or born into out of your control, you would have to leave out. You would have to leave aside. So the idea is that when you do the work together, when you take on this shared political project of a kind of profound overarching social engineering, the idea is once you have made certain decisions, once you have adopted a plan and decided or thrown your support behind the implementation of different rules and structures and so forth, you don't want it to happen that when you remove that veil, after this process is unfolded, when you remove that veil, you say, oh shit, I just agreed to all these policies that make it impossible to live as, say, a trans person. But it turns out I'm trans. I had no idea. Or, oh shit, I just put my full support behind these policies that overwhelmingly favor the rich. but it turns out I'm quite poor, right? Or I just supported all these ideas that give greater support, so this sort of unequal support, to males in our society, or to maybe adults over children. So I've agreed to disadvantage all of these others, and now it turns out that I'm actually one of them. And so, I mean, that's one way in which this humorous, as it is, comic relates to this really important philosophical point. So if you're trying to figure out what someone should do in the so-called trolley problem, well, how you go about taking that question seriously and entertaining possible responses or solutions to it will vary dramatically where it is that you find yourself in your, as it were, original position. So when you remove the veil, are you controlling the lever, or are you somehow tied to the track? Well, either way, you don't want to have yourself put at a disadvantage once that specificity of the conditions that constrain your involvement in this overall situation is revealed or made clear. Okay, so does that make sense? Yeah, go ahead, Connor.
I just wanted to say there's some lyrics in a song by a band that I like, and it's not like 100%, you know, in tandem with this, but I feel like it has some relevance. And the lyrics go, it takes more than one person to decide what's fair. So I think it's like a similar concept.
Yeah, that is relevant. That's a good point. And why does it take more than one person to decide what's fair? Maybe it wouldn't if we accepted the conditions of the so-called trolley problem, which is always very abstract, right? So whenever you're trying to solve the trolley problem, you always imagine that you're this guy here. And so look at this guy. I mean, it's basically a stick figure. So why is that relevant in terms of, I mean, it's not a relevant aesthetic point. It's a relevant moral theoretical point, because if everyone is this stick figure, then that means everyone starts from precisely the same situation, the same social economic status, the same abstract sort of caricatured, cartoonish, universal situation. But that's in fact not how the world is. So we are always already in this or that situation, having been impacted and influenced and shaped by all these various contingencies, which come to a kind of overwhelming confluence that make me and my basic starting point from which I can ask these questions and entertain answers to them quite a bit different from you and how you might come to respond to this. So then if we all were this little stick figure, if we all started from the same abstract universal starting point to address all of these problems, then we really could just have one person deciding it all. But the fact is that we need multiple perspectives because we exist in a pluralistic universe, a pluralistic social political world in which our differences can't be accounted for in advance, right? We have to do the hard work of coming to recognize facts. And many of these facts, although on the surface are non-moral, we need to get clarity, and we need to find at least some kind of shared understanding or agreement on the nature and impact and direction of these facts if we want to make any headway at posing kind of moral rather than non-moral solutions, or ways of, if not solutions, ways of responding to and managing these problems. Okay. All right. So any final questions about that? All right, so let me pull up this video. All right, so this is a video created, I said, by Curiosity Stream, and it's from 2019. So I imagine by and large, it's pretty accurate. So let me share this, and it's about 8 minutes. So watch this video, and then we will discuss it together, and we'll also talk about a couple of the moral dilemmas from chapter 21, and then we'll just get some clarity together on the major concepts that are at play when discussing this issue. So let me enlarge the screen.
Possible by Curiosity Stream. Watch any of their more than 2,000 documentaries for free by visiting curiositystream.com/real-life-lore. Earth is an unequal place. It always has been, and maybe it always will be, but few people are truly aware about the extent of Earth's true inequality. This video is an exploration into the real world and the real reality. Let's begin with the global population of humans currently in 2019, approximately 7.7 billion people. There also exists approximately 317 trillion US dollars in global wealth across the world. In a perfectly equal world, if all of this wealth was evenly distributed to all 7.7 billion of us, it would mean that everybody, regardless of age, would have $41,169 to their names. But we don't live in a perfectly equal world, so to understand the reality of the situation more, let's shrink all of those 7.7 billion people down to only 100 people to better represent everybody, and place them all in a single file line in order of how much money they have. The first staggering thing to notice here is that the first 70 people in this line all have net worths below $10,000. In order to break into the top 50% of people in the world, you only need to have $4,120. The first 70 people in this line are essentially all inside of the global lower class, and they only control 3% of the world's wealth between them. Most of these 70 people are located in places like India, where the average adult net worth is only $7,000, or in Africa, where the average adult net worth is only $4,000. The next 21 people in the line represent the global middle class, with net worths averaging between $10,000 and $100,000. Even still though, these 21 people are underrepresented because they control only about 12% of the global wealth pool. In order to break into the global top 10%, you need to acquire a net worth of $93,170. So moving on, the next 8 people in the line are the first people who could probably be considered to be very well off. These 8 have net worths ranging between $100,000 and $800,000 and would be considered the global upper middle class. Most of these 8 people are found in places like Europe, where the mean average adult has a net worth of $145,000, or 36 times higher than an average African adult. Or in North America, where the mean average adult has a net worth of $404,000. This means that average Americans, Canadians, and Europeans are well inside of the global top 10%. Together, these 8 people control 38% of the entire world's wealth. But even they don't have anywhere near as much money as this guy does, the richest person in the group of 100. He represents the top 1% of the global population, and he controls a mind-boggling 47% of the entire world's wealth, or nearly half. In order to break into the global 1%, you need to have a net worth of at least $770,000. No average person in any country on Earth is inside of the top 1% club. Inside of the top 1% are approximately 42 million US dollar millionaires who are located across the world, representing 0.6% of the global population. But even further up than that, at the very top echelons of the 1% are the billionaire class. As of 2018, there are 2,208 billionaires across the world, with a combined wealth of 9.1 trillion US dollars. If the wealth of billionaires was measured as a yearly GDP, they would have the 3rd largest economy in the world, ahead of Japan and Germany combined. And the wealth of the billionaire class has been steadily increasing over time. Just 2 years ago in 2017, the billionaire class was worth only $7.67 trillion. And just as recently as 2000, the billionaire class wasn't even worth $1 trillion. At the very, very top of the billionaire class are 10 individual people, the 10 wealthiest people in the world. The top 8 of these men, Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, Bernard Arnault, Carlos Slim, Amancio Ortega, Larry Ellison, and Mark Zuckerberg, have a combined wealth greater than the bottom 50% of the human population, or 3.85 billion people. What's also interesting, though, is the way that extreme wealth and people tend to congregate in the same few parts of the world. An ultra high net worth individual is a person who has a minimum net worth of $30 million, and most of them, 70% to be exact, live in just these 10 cities across the world: Tokyo, Osaka, Hong Kong, Paris, London, New York City, Washington, D.C., Chicago, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Half of these mega concentrations of the world's wealthiest are cities inside of America, which struggles with its own economic inequality problem. In 2017, the net worths of every single household in the United States added together to 94.7 trillion US dollars. If we took this and divided it equally to all 124 million households inside of the country, that would be $760,000 per American family. The reality is obviously much different, though. The bottom 50% of American families average only an $11,000 net worth, while the wealthiest 400 Americans have more money than all of them, or 163 million Americans combined. In order to break into the top 1% of Americans, you need to have a net worth of at least $10,374,000. And in this country, the top 1% of Americans control roughly 38% of the country's wealth. While considering the 1% at the global scale control more like 47% of the wealth, the United States is actually doing better at economic equality than the world average is. But if you want to see what the worst country in the world for economic equality is like, you needn't look any further than South Africa, labeled by the World Bank as the most unequal country on Earth. Here, the bottom 60% of the country controls only 7% of the nation's wealth, which is actually a little better than the global averages. But the top 1% of South Africans control an overwhelming 70% of the entire nation's wealth, which is much more severe than the global average. The country where the wealthiest 1% control the least amount of the nation's wealth is Norway, where the top 1% only control 21% of the country's total wealth. While the distribution of money may be pretty unequal in the world, the distribution of knowledge doesn't have to be. You just watched through probably 6 or 7 minutes of me explaining some realities about our society. So why not continue your learning about society, or anything else really for that matter, for free by going and checking.
All right, we can cut short their advertising now. All right, so I imagine many of those figures aren't all that shocking or surprising for most of you, but was anyone really surprised by any of those facts or statistics, or is anyone completely unfamiliar with those?
I personally think it would be interesting to see a more updated version of this, because it mentioned Jeff Bezos as the richest man in the world, and Elon Musk recently passed him, and Elon Musk wasn't anywhere near on their top 10 charts. So it'd just be interesting to get a more updated version.
I hadn't heard that, I don't think. Is that true? Elon Musk surpassed? Okay. When did that happen? It must have been pretty recently.
I think it was really recently.
Maybe, yeah, past
Last
month.
It was like 2 weeks ago.
Oh, wow. All right. So super recent. Yeah.
There's
Yeah,
also the 2 Redditors that passed him because of the big, GameStop thing.
Right. I mean, yeah, just looking at the pandemic time, where figures like Jeff Bezos have increased their wealth substantially, now looking at just the past month or so with these major and completely unprecedented upheavals in the global market, a lot of those statistics are obsolete, even though we're talking about 2019 here. And so I think that's worth talking about, right? That fact alone, that these figures are given to substantially transform themselves and constantly change. So that just speaks to the greater uncertainty that we're all kind of struggling with or saddled with. But yeah, thanks for mentioning that, Brendan. I hadn't heard that. Because yeah, the last I looked at these figures, you're right. And this was shown in that video, Elon Musk wasn't really anywhere near that kind of top 10 or top 8 in particular. Yeah, so that's really interesting. Any other thoughts about that?
Just a random fact. I think that I read in the last couple of days, maybe even, that Jeff Bezos announced that he's going to be stepping down from what, president or owner or whatever of Amazon, right? I think it is. Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah, he's stepping down. So it was like a really big thing.
But he's still going to be part of Amazon, just not CEO.
Yeah, I forgot. Does anyone remember the name of a specific title he's taking on? I forgot what it is. I think it was just invented. I think he just created it for himself. But yeah, he's not stepping down exactly. In fact, he'll still be exerting control over the operations to a large extent. Any other comments or questions?
I also think it would be interesting to see liquid assets, like how much actual cash like these people have, because most of like Jeff Bezos' net worth and Elon Musk's net worth are tied up within like stocks in their companies.
Mhm.
And so if they were to like sell those stocks off to get the liquid assets, the price would obviously decrease. And so it'd be interesting to see like how much liquid asset each of those people have.
Yeah, I mean, I may be wrong about this, but isn't that calculated in most figures that are deciding or figuring out net worth? Or is that a part of that, or?
Yeah, it's like liquid and then plus like their stock options and all those other investments that they have.
Mhm. Yeah, but I mean, so the difference between, one's capital and other assets and then liquid access to those resources is pretty significant. And a lot of wealthy people would say things like, oh no, I'm actually quite poor. You have more money than I do. Because all of my money is in, my fabulous mansions and my yachts and so forth, or things like that. So I was reminded of, I think Trump said something like that to someone a few years ago before he was president. Like, oh no, that homeless man over there, he has more money in his cup than I do. Things like that. All right, so anything else? I now want to turn us to the textbook. So all of our chapters, including the preliminary ones that we've worked through already, although we haven't spent any time with these dilemmas, but they all have a series of dilemmas. And so for just a few minutes of small group discussion in breakout rooms, I'd like us to respond to one of these dilemmas. So let me pull it up here and share the screen. Okay. So this is the second of the 3 dilemmas from chapter 21. And the third one is interesting too. I mean, the first of the 3 dilemmas is also worthwhile, but it's a little too complex. And I don't think enough concrete details or pieces of information are supplied to carry out a very meaningful discussion. But the second dilemma is pretty interesting. And so hopefully you can see the screen. So this is from chapter 21, the second dilemma. Sorry, I can't find the page number on here if you have the physical book. But so United, I'll just read this for us together. So the UN, in criticism aimed primarily at the United States, Japan, and the European Union, a UN report said rich donor nations have failed to deliver on promises to help the world's poorest countries and must increase aid by $18 billion a year. And so let me just check when this was published. This is fairly old, but it's relevant. So this is from 2008. So it's worth keeping that in mind. But the report released Thursday also criticized the failure of rich and poor nations to reach a trade pact in 7 years of negotiations that would expand global trade opportunities for developing countries to reduce poverty. It called for redoubled efforts to conclude negotiations. The report was issued ahead of a September 25th meeting of world leaders at UN headquarters to step up efforts to achieve the Millennium Development Goals adopted by world leaders at a summit in 2000. The goals include cutting extreme poverty by half, ensuring universal primary school education, and starting to reverse the HIV/AIDS pandemic, all by 2015. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon told a press conference that the report, quote, sounds a strong alarm. So here's from the report. The main message, or this is from the press conference, the main message is that while there has been progress on several counts, delivery on commitments made by member states has been deficient and has fallen behind schedule. We are already in the second half of our contest against poverty. We are running out of time. Ban noted that total aid from the world's major donation or donor nations amounts to only 0.25% of their combined national income, far below the UN target of 0.7. The only countries to reach or exceed that target were Denmark, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, and Sweden. And so here's the question of the dilemma that Vaughan draws from this particular situation. Is the failure of rich nations, and so in particular, those rich nations that are targeted here in the criticism being the US, Japan, and collectively the European Union. So is the failure of rich nations to aid the world's poorest countries morally wrong? Is the giving of aid a moral obligation for rich nations or a superrogatory act? And for those, so those who did the reading, the beginning of chapter 21, you should have a clear sense of that category of superrogatory actions. So what conclusion do you draw from the US's failure to contribute its promised share of aid? All right. And so you might want to find this in the digital copy of the textbook for discussion purposes. So I want to put you guys into some breakout rooms for just a few minutes to talk about this. So really this question is about whether or not there's such a thing as a positive duty of beneficence, right? So is the failure, is the deficiency in aid allocation by the affluent countries, we've already recognized it as a failure, given that there were certain explicit commitments made, but is it a moral failure? And so that's really the question. And then we'll talk about that together. So are there any questions, any need of clarity before I put you into breakout rooms? All right, so if not, I'll go ahead and make those rooms now. So I'll create 5 rooms with 3 or 4 participants each, and I'll let you know when to start wrapping up your conversation. And then when we get out of the breakout rooms, we'll talk for a little bit about it and we'll take a break. And then we'll work through just a few slides to ensure mutual clarity and understanding on the major concepts at play for this week. All right, so I'll go ahead and put you into the rooms now. And I'll see you in a few minutes. All right, let's just wait for everyone to come back. All right, I think we're all here. So how did your groups react to this dilemma? Does anyone want to start us off with some thoughts that came up?
When I saw that they were talking about promises that these countries made, I was thinking about Kant and how he discussed how promises, if they're made, they should be kept and to be delivered through. So I feel like that was a failing on rich nations if they made that promise. And also, I did the reading, and with like libertarian theories of justice, how like everyone is for themselves. I feel like if people follow through with that, everyone's gonna be like just relying on themselves, and then if somebody else is in need, if that country is in need and they need help, no one is really gonna follow through on it. And kind of like the whole idea of the trolley problem, where you don't know where you're gonna be ended up. I feel like that idea with libertarianism kind of falls into that. I just generally believe that people should help others. Like, I don't know what the exact position I'm in with ethics in that regard, but I feel like everyone should help others. And I feel like rich nations have an obligation to help poor countries if needed.
Good, very well said. So you think, or this view was at least expressed in your group discussion, that the failure would be a moral failure. And it seems like you came to that conclusion on a couple of different grounds. So it could be understood as a failure in the way that not meeting the terms of any kind of obligation is a failure, right? And so that's Kantian. But then you implicitly, I think, expressed the Kantian idea that we find in one of the so-called imperfect duties, right? As well. But there are a couple little weird yellow hands up. So Hunter and then Poppy. So Hunter, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I was looking at limitations and restrictions. Yes, we should help people. I definitely agree. But at some point, if we're being exploited and we don't have the money ourselves, how are we supposed to keep shelling it out to people eternally? Why is there no end to this obligation? If it's an agreement, usually there is a conclusion. I don't know. Instead, it's just, I feel like I should just keep paying you because you are poor. Why don't we reinvest in something? Why don't we say, you structurally don't have this system. Why don't we help you build this way to protect yourself or govern yourself or reinvest in yourself, so that way we're not paying you 2 centuries down the line. You're paying us. Like,
Yeah. So, I mean, Peter Singer, as we'll see on Wednesday, has a kind of response to that. He would say, well, the point of termination where we should stop as affluent or members of affluent nations giving to support those who are impoverished would be when poverty is more or less eliminated. And if we make a good faith effort towards that end, which would amount, and I think you're correct about this, it would entail sweeping in really strong structural reforms and not just this kind of conveyor belt of money going across with no end in sight.
You give me 600 for a stimulus check, I buy an iPhone. I don't do my rent. So I just felt like there was a lot of wasted money that could have been reinvested in better places.
Right, and I think you also made the point too at the beginning of what you said about how it's about, and this is Singer's argument, which critics have challenged or attempted to repudiate in different ways, but the supposition as the starting point seems to be all of us as individuals that have our own kind of economic wherewithal from which we can make the free decision to contribute aid where it's needed. But is that the best way to think about it? Is it incumbent on us as private individuals, or does the major structural reform that is in order, that seems to be necessary, move at a scale above that? Right. So let me go to Poppy. So Poppy has her hand, or a hand up.
Well, Hunter and I are basically on the same path because we were in the same group. But I just kind of wanted to touch on bringing Kant into this, because Kant doesn't necessarily say that we shouldn't break promises. He says that we shouldn't make promises without the intention of keeping them.
Mhm.
So really, we're not getting at the fact that maybe these countries that we've promised wealth to are misusing the wealth that we're giving them. Maybe they're using it to do really immoral things that the US can't condone. Maybe they're pouring it into the sex trade or something like that. We don't necessarily know. So I think we should probably aid people who are going to, like Hunter said, reinvest into something that's mutually beneficial for us and for them and for just the general population living in this world. And we shouldn't necessarily be giving tons of wealth to people that are going to invest in like cigarettes or something like that. So we really need to encourage like a beneficial use of the wealth and just not pour it out to make everyone equal if they're not going to equally use it in a good way.
Okay. Fair point. Maybe from another group, does anyone else want to share a perspective that might have come up? Connor, did you want to say something?
Yeah, sure. So just to like, I guess play devil's advocate, one of the things discussed in my group was say like, because I would say that yes, it is morally wrong to not be providing this aid, but at the same time, nobody knows what's going to happen in the future, and so who's to say that next week or next month events transpire that land us, these wealthy countries, these well-off nations in a similar or worse off predicament than the nations and regions that we would otherwise be supplying the aid to.
Yeah, so I mean, you're really speaking to the problem, and this is a problem with Singer's argument, at least the strong edge of his argument, which advocates for giving up to the point of marginal utility. So some have pointed out, well, if we give up to the point of marginal utility, at which point we will be put in a comparable position of suffering as those that the gift of aid would actually be helping, well, then we'll be destabilizing ourselves. And that's, a legitimate concern, especially given the ongoing ravages of the effects of climate change. So we're not talking about some future eventuality, but we're looking at those effects we ourselves have experienced here, looking at the increased fire seasons and intensity of the fires, for example, like the Almeida fire. And so we're put into this precarious position where we're almost like medieval peasants, not knowing what the earth is going to have in store for us from one year to the next. And so there are a couple of approaches you can take with this recognition in place. So one would be to say, well, we can't give so much that we are rendered really weak and vulnerable, like those that we're trying to help. But then on the other side, you're recognizing a greater need to help those who are already weak and vulnerable, especially given the outsized effect of climate change on those populations that have really made the least contribution to it, but are shouldering the burden more than anybody else. And so the issue, and this is particularly salient, I think, in connection to Singer's argument, even though he presented this argument in response to a different problem that was under the world's gaze in the 1970s, but the problem of the Bengali Cyclone that devastated, this kind of natural disaster, right? This environmental catastrophe that devastated that population. And that devastation happened not because of choices that the individual citizens or the government officials were making in terms of what to do with the resources, right? So it happened to them regardless of those choices. And so given that very affluent countries like the United States are in a dramatically outsized way pumping greenhouse gases and carbon emissions into the environment, which those in the most vulnerable parts of the world are suffering from more and more, well, that puts us in a place to recognize this sort of mutual obligation or I would say greater obligation that we in the wealthiest countries have. But yeah, so I mean, that speaks to the point that B was making earlier, and this goes back to Kant. So remember, Kant said that it's an imperfect duty, and so recognizing this as an imperfect duty means that the contrary failed the test of conception in will. So whether or not we could conceptualize a world in which we would want to live this way. And so if you imagine that the world is such that we don't have an obligation to help anybody, well, you're kind of, and I think this is speaking to B's point, you are putting yourself at a disadvantage because you're invariably going to need help. And that's especially true looking at the surprising and unpredictable paths that these ongoing effects of climate change are taking. Right? So this is really just to say that we need to broaden our focus or perspective to adopt a more cosmopolitan point of view. But the points that have been made by Poppy and Hunter and others about where is the end goal? What are we working towards? Are we just over time putting a Band-Aid on a wound that keeps opening up and getting bigger and bigger? We need to think more broadly. We need to think from a kind of bigger picture, not just in terms of space, but in terms of time as well. What is the ideal end state towards which we are striving in this shared challenge or shared struggle? It can't just be to keep people above water, just a little bit above their heads above water every year. And so this speaks again to Singer's point that we'll see on Wednesday, that we kind of have to undertake, as painful or difficult as it might seem, a major transformation or overhaul of our basic conceptual framework by which we think about duties and obligations, national borders, and so forth, because the state of reality is way ahead of that, right? We're sort of lurching behind reality with these outdated concepts and these outdated systems. But yeah, there's a lot of good points here that you guys have come to. Anybody else have something to add? Okay, so let us look at some slides real quick. Instead of taking a break, we'll just get out of here a bit early, 5 to 10 minutes early, maybe sooner. It depends on if there are any questions or if any of these categories need more careful fleshing out. Okay. So the central theme of discussion for this week, of discussion for this week is global economic justice. But of course, that presupposes that we have some understanding of what justice is, very generally. So to keep this quite simple, justice is the morality of persons getting what is fair, what is their due. So deserts is another concept at play here. Not necessarily the fourth meal that you enjoy after dinner, but what it is that you deserve because of a number of factors that we can take into account. We can take into account the conditions that you are grappling with or from which you're pursuing particular ends. It could be the history or background of your own activities, your own behaviors. So all these factors play into this concept of justice and its connection to desert. So given all these factors, what should be given, what should be received, what is owed? And so we can break this down in terms of local justice. So the people with whom we share an immediate social circle, people to whom we have compelling concrete obligations, not simply members of our own family, but members of our community, people that we interact with economically, socially, and so forth. And then there's the broader understanding of justice within the purview of a global focus. So Here we're talking about people that, at least in the immediate sense, lie beyond the scope of our own connections of intimacy or economic entanglement. And I say at least immediate sense because it's fairly clear, given the global economy, that even those at far-flung places in impoverished or wealthy countries with whom we don't think we have any direct or even indirect association, well, they're affected in unseen, subtle, but perhaps in some cases extreme ways by our decisions. And when I say our, I don't just mean as individuals, but as a kind of society. And so here are just some of those facts pulled from the beginning of this chapter. So these are a little bit old, but still quite relevant. And so the kind of gap, the extreme inequality that we're countenancing here with respect to the global situation has really only gotten worse since 2010. So the facts would be far more extreme in the bad direction now if we were to get very current and up to date on them. So the number of people living in extreme poverty as of 2010, and especially, you know, looking at 2021, 2020 after this pandemic, these facts would be even worse, obviously. So that number was 1.2 billion. And then from the 2 years between 2011 and 2013, there were 842 million people suffering from chronic hunger. The number of children under 5 who die every day from preventable causes. So from physical ailments, hunger, thirst, lack of shelter, and so forth, 18,000. And then in 2005, and this figure has changed dramatically as we've seen in certain ways, at least in terms of the individuals representing these statistics, the richest 20% of the world consumed 75% of it's goods. So that's a pretty staggering number, right? The richest 20% in 2005. It's not that long ago, but it's still a fair bit of time ago. The richest 20% of the world consumed 75% of its goods. And so here are some concepts that we've talked about already with the preliminary chapters from our textbook. So now let's just move towards getting some clear definitions. So what is a right? Well, a right is a claim, or a claim specifically to being entitled to something, a moral demand that obligates others to act accordingly. And so if there is a right, which is a demand that obligates a kind of action or response, then that means corresponding to every right or every such claim is a duty. And so that's something to be clear about. If there is a right at issue, then there is necessarily a duty, which is the sort of flip side of that coin. Now it's worth noting, Peter Singer will talk about his argument through our group presentations debates on Wednesday, but Peter Singer, a utilitarian, argues quite vociferously, right, quite strongly for the existence and the bindingness of not just negative rights, but positive rights. But he doesn't share that necessarily with all other utilitarians as utilitarians. So for example, Jeremy Bentham, the dude from the 18th century who came up with the philosophic or the hedonic calculus, famously he said that, and this was in response to criticism that utilitarianism doesn't take rights seriously, Bentham said, the very concept of rights is nonsense on stilts. So Bentham, an early utilitarian, didn't have much consideration for the significance of rights or even the reality of rights. Nonsense on stilts. So you see a silly looking person, well, you might say they're presenting nonsense. Well, that's ratcheted up quite a bit if they're walking around on stilts, right? But a negative right is sometimes referred to as a right of non-interference. So a negative right, and again, there will be correspondingly, if there is such a right, a negative duty, right? So negative duties have corresponding negative rights and vice versa. But a negative right or a right of non-interference is something that obligates others, and this is why we use the language of negative. It doesn't mean bad. So we're using it in the strict logical sense of negative, which means to deny or to take away, or to abstain or withhold, right? So in this case, a negative right means, if you have one, that others have a kind of duty or obligation, and we should understand obligation and duty as synonymous, as interchangeable. That means that others would have a duty or obligation to abstain from doing something or to withhold any sort of intervention. Whereas a positive right, if they exist, and this is much more controversial, almost no one, I can't think of any philosopher who thinks that there's no such thing as a negative right, but there are quite a few philosophers and ordinary individuals who believe that the idea of a positive right is, in Bentham's language, nonsense on stilts. But a positive right, if you have one, would mean that somebody else is obligated or duty bound to do something for you specifically, rather than just to avoid doing something to you that might hamper your freedom. So does this distinction make sense? Negative and positive rights? So can anyone think of an example of a negative right? Or, because this is the flip side of the same coin, a negative duty? Can anyone think of an example there?
Like with Kant, not lying to people, or because it essentially hinders their autonomy.
Good, yeah. So if Kant, but it would imply the same thing. You could have a right. A right is a which demands or constrains another person to recognize it, and on the basis of that right, alter their behavior. And so if you have a duty to be honest, then that's only sensible, or intelligible rather. That only makes sense if there are others in the world that have a corresponding right not to be lied to. That is, to put it in the language of the second version of the categorical imperative, the right to be respected as autonomous agents. So in our own system of government, our legal structures, can anyone think of examples of negative rights and negative duties? So think of the language that goes into the founding documents for this very country, our very political constitution. What are the famous rights that we supposedly have?
Can't suppress somebody's freedom of speech.
Yeah, so you have a right to free speech, or in the First Amendment, a right to free assembly. Sorry, I'm trying to, this thing's so fucking awkward. I'm trying to get back to the chat. You see there's activity here. Okay, yeah, the Bill of Rights, like the First and Second Amendment. Yeah, so you have the right to bear arms. I mean, we can just use that one because it's kind of fun. It's more complicated than just you have the right to bear arms, of course. But what does that right mean? Is that a negative right or a positive right?
Negative.
And how so?
You know what? No, actually, no, I would say, I guess I would stick with negative because it's meant to prevent our government, probably primarily, from disallowing you to bear arms.
Yeah, exactly. So it's tricky. It's tricky because of the language. There's no negation or no not. So you might suppose that this is a positive right. But if it were a positive right, and I say I have the right to bear arms, and that means somebody has to give me guns. So if I'm yelling out there in the street about my right being infringed on, and I have fundamental confusion about the nature of rights, it might be that I'm expecting some authority of a kind to give me weapons, right? That's not what it means. It's a negative right. It just says that under certain circumstances or conditions, the government cannot simply arbitrarily seize my arms, right? Okay. And like the right to free assembly, it just means that the government and its authority can't break up my meeting unless it's, of course, planting or working through some kind of seditious effort. It doesn't mean that I have the right for other people to come hang out with me when I say I have a right to free assembly. Good. But
plotting a coup at taco night. Who's coming?
What's that?
We're plotting a coup of the government at taco night. You guys are welcome to join. Free assembly.
A coup at taco night, a taco coup.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Show them who's the ground beef around here.
And that's on Tuesday though, right? Taco Tuesday?
Yeah, at 6:30.
All right, cool. Good to know. But what about, so like I'm thinking of the language of John Locke, so leaving the Bill of Rights aside. And so people like Thomas Jefferson, who contributed the ideological or philosophical political underpinnings for our system of government. So there's this idea that we have these inalienable rights. What are these rights? Does anyone know what I'm talking about?
Was something like the pursuit of happiness? I can't remember the first part of it.
Yeah, that's one.
Life, liberty.
Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness.
Good. Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. The pursuit of happiness was a little innovation, I think, on the part of Thomas Jefferson. For Locke, it was really life, liberty, and property. But any of those, so when I say I have a right to life, if I understood that to be a positive right, then I would have a legitimate grievance on my deathbed. Even if I'm 90 years old, I could say, hey, why am I dying? I thought I had a right to life. So the idea that one has a right to life simply means that under or for illegitimate reasons, someone representing the government, for example, or someone who might be as a citizen punished by the government can simply come and take your life, can't murder you, right? So those are all negative rights. We really find no positive rights that play a major role in the structure of this kind of ideological or philosophical framework that guided the drawing up of our political organization. But yeah, Connor, do you have something?
I might be getting ahead of us because it's just like a question regarding the positive rights, and actually kind of ties in with the life, liberty, and whatnot, because of what you're talking about, the right to life. I don't know, it crossed my mind that maybe a positive right, I don't know if any of these philosophies are like stated as permissible to commit suicide. And therefore, I don't know, it just comes to mind as maybe something that might be a positive right, is like you have a positive right to live, because I mean, I don't know, it's kind of like a duty to do because you have a life. I don't know.
Yeah, so you have according to Kant, you have a perfect duty to yourself to preserve your own life to the extent that you're able. That is, not to deliberately take your own life in view of the promise of ongoing or worsened suffering. But that doesn't necessarily obligate anybody else, because for Kant, this is specifically a duty or obligation that one has to oneself. Because remember, Kant carves up these duties in terms of duties to self and duties to others, right? So then it would still be a negative duty to not kill yourself, right? But then there's a similar right that can be articulated in the positive vein, which says you have a positive obligation to improve yourself. And I say that it's related to that negative duty against suicide because if you do improve yourself over time, then maybe you'll find yourself less inclined to want to kill yourself. Right? Does that make sense? Okay. All right, so let's move on. So here's that important distinction. The category of supererogation was mentioned very briefly in connection to the moral dilemma. So there is a duty of beneficence, which is a positive duty. That's a moral obligation to benefit others. And then there are also superrogatory actions, which philosophers like Kant recognized as well. So this would be conduct that is above and beyond duty. It's not required, but if it's performed, it's praiseworthy. So a canonical example of superrogatory action would be in the context of a war, where a soldier decides to throw themselves on a grenade to save their comrades. They might get some sort of honorific recognition, an award or something posthumously. It would be seen as heroic and brave and so forth. Everyone would praise their name. But in a situation where a soldier decides not to throw themselves on a grenade to save everyone, it's not as if people would be like, man, you're a moral monster. How could you have not sacrificed your life to save everyone? And so supererogatory actions or supererogatory obligation, and put that way, it's kind of a contradiction, or there's a tension to it, is peculiar in that if you perform an action that's supererogatory, you can be praised, but if you do not perform an action that would be perceived as supererogatorily good, then you can't be blamed, right? And so this is a really important distinction to have in mind when reading Peter Singer's argument. So a lot of what he's doing in the course of presenting and articulating that view is grounded in this distinction. And he, by the way, he wants to reject the very status of supererogation, excuse me. And so again, we're talking about justice. And so it's important to define justice in terms of the context of its consideration or deployment. So we often in the criminal justice system, for instance, talk about justice. But here what we're focused on is justice of a retributive nature. So we're looking for fair retribution. So punishment or wrongdoing usually, but this is also in play when we're considering honorifics, when we're considering recognizing something for good. So we would want to give them what is owed, that is recognition of their moral behavior. But then there's distributive justice, and that's really the focus of this week's issue, this week's moral issue. So this is justice concerning the fair distribution of society's commodities and goods, whether that would be food, adequate nutrition, access to education, healthcare, and other such elements that are seen to be necessary or at least very much substantial or significant for the possibility of well-being or a flourishing life. And there's the difference between libertarian theories of justice. So here we're not talking about, for example, the existing Libertarian Party as a political party in the US. This is a kind of philosophy or ideology. So libertarian theories of justice emphasize individual liberties and negative rights and reject positive rights, thinking of the very notion of positive rights as a kind of violation of one's freedom. So if I tell you, you have an obligation of beneficence to somehow improve the conditions of my life, well, then I would effectively be demanding that you sacrifice some measure of your own freedom, which from the point of view of libertarianism is a violation. So it would be indefensible. And that's versus egalitarian theories of justice, according to which the very principle, moral principle of justice demands an equal distribution of these commodities among all persons who are in a position to enjoy or receive them. And so here we're talking about specifically a global egalitarian theory of justice, where we're taking into account the needs and conditions of all global citizens. So here we're talking again from a cosmopolitan kind of point of view. And so there are various arguments that we can find within the ambit of libertarian ideology on this score, but quite broadly, the libertarian asserts that we have no duty to help the poor and hungry of the world. We are not obligated. So we'll be pushing this point repeatedly in different contexts as we go ahead. When we talk about duty and obligation, we're talking about precisely the same thing. Those terms are interchangeable and they point essentially to the ought, right? So what ought I do? What should I do, morally speaking, in this particular circumstance? Let me check the chat here. Oh, good. So Connor's asking about positive rights with respect to one having certain wards or children, for example. So relations of caretaker to one taken care of or ward. But that's exactly what someone from a libertarian point of view might say, that we do have positive duties, but those positive duties are grounded in concrete specific relationships that we freely enter into. So I freely participate in the actions which produce a child for which I am now responsible. And so I would fail in my duty to the child, but some stranger walking down the street who might see that the kid I'm walking around with has no shoes, the stranger isn't failing by not buying my child shoes. From the libertarian point of view, the stranger has no obligation to my child. The obligation is only because of the unique relationship that I as a parent have with the child. Or it doesn't even have to be one of familiarity. It can be one of a social contractual nature. So for example, if you go to a public pool, you would say that you have a right to be rescued. If you're drowning, you would have a right to be rescued by the lifeguard that's on duty. But if you just go to like a lake somewhere where there is no specific figure that is on site who has a contractual obligation in virtue of their freely adopted role, then you don't have a right to say all these people ought to, possibly endanger themselves to rescue me from the lake in which I'm drowning, right? Okay. So yeah, that's a good question. But does that answer it? Does that make sense, Connor? So it's not that from the libertarian point of view, positive rights don't exist. It's just that they don't exist in the same way that negative rights do. So if negative rights exist, then they hold regardless of who I am as a particular individual. So if I have a right not to be murdered by other people in my society, I didn't achieve that right through any particular action that I've undertaken or because of any specific relationship in which I find myself. I have that right simply in virtue of my being a person. But positive rights are quite different, libertarians think. They think that positive rights come about only because of actions and choices that individuals make and because of the specificity of relationships in which they find themselves with others. Okay. So here's an example. John Hospers was for a while a confidant and a friend of Ayn Rand, so the rational egoist we've talked about before, but she later broke with him for whatever reason. She did that a lot, broke with her friends, tossed them out. She was a fairly ornery person. But John Hospers is a famous libertarian philosopher, and he says, the political philosophy that is called libertarianism is the doctrine that every person is the owner of his own life and that no one is the owner of anyone else's life, and that consequently every human being has the right to act in accordance with his own choices, unless those actions infringe on the equal liberty of other human beings to act in accordance with their choices. And this is more or less a kind of recapitulation of the so-called libertarian principle from John Stuart Mill, so one of the major utilitarian thinkers. Okay. But here are some key criticisms. Okay, so I'm going to let us go after I just mentioned these, and then we'll pick up on this before we get into the presentations next time. But there's just a quick glance at some criticisms of libertarian theories. And before we get into the presentations, next time we'll talk about egalitarianism. But one problem is that this doctrine seems to conflict with common sense morality. So this is the example with which Peter Singer begins his argument, as we'll see on Wednesday. You're walking past a shallow pond. You're the only one there. You witness a child drowning. To rescue the child, to prevent this very bad thing from happening, all you would have to do is wade into the pond. You don't even have to know how to swim yourself, and pull her out. In doing so, you might dirty your shoes or ruin your clothes, but that's a perfectly acceptable sacrifice in the interest of saving a human life. And so our basic moral intuition, critics of libertarianism think, is that you would have definitely failed morally if you saw this child drowning and you said, it's not my kid. I don't know this kid. It's not my problem. And you just pass, right? So imagine, I don't know, you're working at Dutch Brothers and someone comes in for their shift and you're like, oh, go on. Like, it's all right. I just walked past this kid who was drowning, but you know, I don't know her and I had to get to work on time. So I just left her there. Well, you might think, well, what the fuck is wrong with you? Like, you should have saved the kid. So if you say you should have, you ought to have saved the kid, the implication is that there was a duty that you failed to realize, that you failed to meet. And so if we think that you have an obligation to save someone with minimal sacrifice or effort on your own part from death, then, or if you think that that's true, well, then you have to accept at least a base level or a minimal level of a positive duty of beneficence, which the libertarian rejects. So critics think there has to be something suspect about this point of view if you could legitimize letting someone basically drown in front of you with no intervention. So we'll talk about some of these other criticisms next time. But are there any questions? Sorry, I'm having trouble here. Computer, trying not to share. Okay. So are there any final questions or comments before we go? All right, well, we'll take some time before getting into the first presentations on Wednesday to clarify further these ideas and questions. But if you groups, so groups 1 and 2, if you have any issues or questions, feel free to reach out, send me an email. And remember to get me the slides or the presentation materials that you plan to use before class on Wednesday. And I will see you guys then. All right, see you.